the constitution, human rights violations, economic crimes, run the country into debt, unsustainable position of debt, 1 trillion to be made in debt repayments alone in the coming year. So there's a temptation to limit our diagnosis to the present failures. But we need to take a step back and look at the Constitution as a journey from independence, looking further into the future. And when we do that, we see that there has been progress in some regards, but there have also been reversals. And those reversals need to inform our next steps. So as I start this, really just maybe getting a little bit more into the institutional architecture of the Constitution from a point of view of inclusion. And of course, I'll be focusing majorly on devolution. As I take a deep dive, this is the context. We recognize that countries, the process of democracy is never straightforward. The process of democracy requires citizen pressure. It will normally be against a state that doesn't want to give up power. In this case, it's a post-colonial state that took the characteristics of the colonial government in terms of acquisition of land, in terms of appropriation and capture of state institutions to benefit a small elite. So the problem that informed the Constitution was the problem of over-centralization of government. And this over-centralization of government was impeding development. So you had large parts of the country that were underdeveloped, that were marginalized, that were neglected, whose politics and ethnicity did not fit in either with the central Kenya when it was under Jomo Kenyatta, or not the Rift Valley politics when it was Moi, and so you needed to be aligned to the political and ethnic interests for you to have development. So we had a situation where I traveled to Lodwar for some work in 2009. It was a dusty little village that was run by the Catholic Church. And that was it. All services, place to stay, Catholic Church. There was actually no government presence in any real form. But then I went back in 2014, and this was like 2 years after devolution, very acrimonious devolution. We're within the transition, and we're doing some work there on and off between 2014 to 2016, and the difference was marked. So we come from a context where large parts of the country didn't have government presence or government expenditure. So the quest for the Constitution change was to build the nation of Kenya, as opposed to having some parts that are progressing and others that are assumed just to fill up the numbers and the quota, and then really outside of the resource sharing, outside of the joint growth. So we have had a problem of over-concentration, and since independence, there have been efforts to redress this. And I won't go much into this because I think this is a conversation that's pretty much out there. The Independence Constitution wanted to deal with the over-centralized, the power that the colonial government had, the way the colonial government administered, and the discussion was very much around a devolved government. So the Independence Constitution instituted devolved government, but the independence government of Jomo Kenyatta feared that this would lead to secession, because they were looking at West Africa and Nigeria, what was happening with the kind of ethnic forces pulling the country apart. So informed by this, they then pushed and within a year repealed that constitution and enacted the Republican Constitution, which was a centralized one, and then successively strengthened the president. So the president had power over the parliament, judicial appointments, There were local governments that were quite autonomous at the start, but then those powers were over time eroded. So power became concentrated in the office of the president, alongside, unfettered grabbing of land. And in Kenya, land is the resource. And even if you look now, a lot of the development bottlenecks we have center around land and an equal distribution of land. So the appropriation, illegal appropriation of land by the Kenyatta administration and those political elites that were close to the founding president marked the first, marked that administration. So centralization of power, grabbing of land, which means grabbing of wealth, which means capture of key institutions. So what happened in terms of development was then emanated from this because of the over-centralization of power. You then had a concentration of development in certain parts of the country, ignoring other parts of the country. The sessional paper of African socialism is blamed for this, kind of unequal development. I think even beyond the policies of the paper is the character of the state, where the state usurps formal planning processes, formal processes of allocating resources. And the reason I say this is Singapore, I believe South Korea might also have borrowed and adapted a version of that sessional paper and used it to grow their countries because they had leaders of integrity. So the foundation of political and state power in the Far East, which we like to liken ourselves, that foundation was rooted in political accountability. And that has to do with their national culture. Our national culture, unfortunately, has been shaped more by the colonial type of governance. We then adopted a form of capitalism, which on one hand was good because we've seen a lot of growth of the private sector, but then it's unfettered and very predatory capitalism, which, predatory capitalism eats institutions. So the bedrock of our political culture was this colonial inheritance and this kind of predatory capitalism, which then means that inevitably you're going to have unequal development. So despite efforts to decentralize, because after, in the 70s already unequal development was becoming a problem, poverty in large parts of the country was a problem, and there were efforts in the early to mid 70s, special rural, special urban areas development project that was trying to grow up to deconcentrate development into urban areas so that you didn't have the influx, the rural urban migration of a lot of people coming into Nairobi city, no services to meet them. So there was another good policy that was put out to try and grow urban centers, but it couldn't work because to grow urban centers, you need to decentralize power. And even at a deconcentration level, that was a problem. So that scheme failed. In the 80s, again, we had now, really failed. Government at this point was really failing. So we had the District Focus for Rural Development to try and decentralize. It was a form of deconcentration. Planning was deconcentrated, but no money followed this planning function. So, and then in the 90s, we had the decentralized funds, which sought to redress the centralization. Now, along the path, as we had these different schemes that would start, be partially implemented, there are lessons. And the interesting thing with Kenya is even the things that didn't work teach us something. So for instance, District Focus for Rural Development taught us about district level planning. And the architecture was pretty good. The problem with the district focus for rural development is it was linked to the provincial administration, which is a colonial tool of control. And you know, that is what distorted it. But in terms of the framework, the idea of having an authority to incur expenditure at the district level, and having planning done at that level, and when they try to deepen the district focus on rural development, you have the district committees. The principle is good, as long as you didn't have now the political arm of the president through the provincial administration. So other lessons, the local authorities, of course, you know, what is happening in Nairobi is reminiscent of what we saw with the local authorities: abject corruption, failure. You know, you have legislators who are not accountable. But you must remember, local authorities were stripped of their powers by the presidency. And these were centralized in a ministry that was directed by the presidency. So local authorities were a shell with some basic functions that they didn't do and didn't do well. And then in the 90s, there was a process of reform. And the local government reform program also teaches us some very good lessons. And one of the most powerful was the LASDAP, the Local Authority Service Delivery Program, which sought to create a very vibrant public participation mechanism. And you know, you had the Local Authority Transfer Fund, by which 5% of all income tax was going to local authorities. And then you have the LASDAP that ensured public participation in the way this money is used. Fantastic model. Countries that did it, local authorities that did it well had very vibrant public participation. So again, lots of lessons to learn from the LASDAP. Then we had the CDF, which came at a time, you know, mooted, I believe it was enacted maybe in 2002, and then became operational in 2003, thereabouts, and was able to bring development to parts of the country that had been marginalized because of political reasons. And so the justification for the CDF was to counter the over-centralization of resources in the areas that are aligned to the president. So CDF had a very good justification and also very valuable lessons. And in fact, CDF has informed the devolution architecture in terms of the sharing of revenue. The FAST formula very much mirrored, you know, picked some of the characteristics of the CDF. Also, project committees form a very good basis for, you know, discussing how to do local development. And there are some counties like Machakos and Makueni that have picked this model of setting up citizen project committees for monitoring development at the local level and giving them a lot of power, such that if you need to pay your contractor, this project committee has to sign off. So even under centralized government, even prior to the constitution, we've had models of governance that have shown the potential that we have as citizens working with government, as government working with citizens. It's unfortunate that our political leadership doesn't listen to this. And as a country, we have a very poor culture of learning and picking what works. We tend to focus on what doesn't work. But nonetheless, we needed constitution change because these efforts were not enough, because majority of the money was stuck in the center and decision-making was stuck in a system where where the all-powerful president had too much say. So the quest of constitution change was one of the big drivers for constitutional change was inclusion, was equity, equity in terms of resources. Inclusion was another in terms of the democratic process. Accountability was another. And if we look at those three, we can then consider how does devolution deal with the issue of equity, with the issue of inclusion, with the issue of accountability. So if we look at the Constitution as an exercise, devolution therefore as seeking to bring this equity to bring inclusion, to bring accountability, we can then consider what's the setup to enable this. And yes, like Regina said, one of the key processes going on right now, the sharing of revenue, is one of the institutional mechanisms set up to ensure we create equity. So the Constitution establishes devolved government, Article 1, and these are sovereign, and these have shared sovereignty, and these are distinct, Article 6, so that they are distinct governments, and national and county governments are equal but distinct with different functions, and they need to cooperate in how they work. So first off the bat, devolution is not, counties are not subservient to the national government or subsidiary units of government. No, they are equal but different. It's almost like a marriage where you have husband and wife, equal but different roles for it to work. So if counties don't work, our development won't work. If national government doesn't work, then it won't work. Aligned to these functional roles that are assigned to national and county government, because these are defined in the Constitution, and they needed to be defined in the Constitution, otherwise national government would have rolled them back. So there's a schedule, Schedule 4, that outlines these different functions and requires national and county government to cooperate, consult, so that they can conduct their mutual relations on a basis of dialogue. So devolution is established in a manner that seeks to redress our adversarial politics. It's a more cooperative, it's a cooperative governance framework. And in terms of equity, the Constitution then provides the principle that funds follow functions. So in an ideal setting, if you had a government that was very much aligned to the Constitution and favorable of devolution, the process was very simple. It was to ask, what work are counties supposed to do? What work is national government supposed to do? What does it cost to do this? And then share the revenue that way. That's what was supposed to happen. So the Constitution laid out the principle with the understanding that then the laws would give life to the process of implementing. But it did institute a safeguard and said not less than 15% of the revenue collected nationally would be shared to these levels. And why this? Because national government has revenue raising powers, county government has revenue raising powers, and then there is the sharing of revenue. And there's also room for additional conditional allocations, and of course borrowing. So why the division of revenue? This is important because the major revenue raising powers are with the national government. The counties have less revenue raising powers. The major service delivery functions are with the counties. The national government has different powers, equally important, but they raise most of the money, counties deliver most of the services. So you need a process where you balance out the revenue share and the functions that are to be conducted by the national and the county government. And this is the division of revenue process. And this has been acrimonious due to many factors that, I don't intend to get really into the nitty-gritty. Suffice to say that the Constitution lays out principles, but it is expected that national governments and the institutions and the county government and the institutions created in between would dialogue, and on a basis of constitutionalism and on a basis of adhering to the objects of devolution, come to a understanding about how revenue would be shared. But this doesn't work when you have a government that's not aligned to the Constitution. You have an administration that voted no for the Constitution and actually did a very aggressive campaign against the Constitution, doesn't believe in devolution, doesn't believe in people. When you look at the way the Jubilee administration conducts itself, it's, heavy hand, top-down kind of very authoritarian and very brutal use of force, even in handling COVID. They don't believe people have the ability that ability to manage their own affairs. The participatory, and this is an administration that this thinking can be informed by vested interests, but it's also a thinking that's rooted maybe in some development approaches that view people as not knowing what they want, as needing technical experts and government experts to help people find themselves. The Constitution takes really a participatory look, believes in people. Sovereignty is vested in the people. Devolution is supposed to give self-governance to the people. So the Constitution is very people-centered. And then you have an administration that philosophically are not aligned to this. So one, there's a philosophical disconnect, but then also there's a governance disconnect, and there's vested interest, corruption. If the more resources that go to the local level, the fewer grand projects with grand kickbacks there'll be for the few bureaucrats and political leaders at the national level who are used to benefit, whose lives are built around benefiting from these kind of national procurement projects. So we have the division of revenue that's become extremely acrimonious. And last year, the process stalled for almost 4 months, might be a little bit more, and counties couldn't get their money. And the question was about the increase, because the Constitution gives criteria for how much should be shared. It's supposed to be a share of the national revenue. It's supposed to be informed by the last audited accounts. It's supposed to factor in certain criteria listed in the Constitution, including inflation and such. And this wasn't happening. So county share, the share of national revenue going to counties has been falling. So this has caused a standoff. And the reason it's been falling is because national government has gotten into heavy debt. They have national flagship projects, which are very politically driven. And these are eating up money. So there's no money. And you heard the president say, Hakuna pesa, what are they gonna do? And so this has also come to bear on the sharing of revenue formula this year. Last year, it was division of revenue. This year, there was no fight. They agreed there's no money, we've accepted. So we'll take the same amount we got last year. But the formula then has to change. And this formula change, apart from the parameter, the objects, the parameters, and the percentages of the formula changing, the formula is also being decided on updated population and poverty statistics. And what happens when you combine these two, the new formula and the new data, you then get a situation where counties lose money. And they're losing money in a context where the total amount shared is fixed. So counties are losing in real time or in real terms. During the transition from the previous sharing formula, some counties lost, but possibly didn't feel it because the total amount available had increased. So if you are getting 10 billion, and then by the formula you need to lose, you'll get 5% less, but then the total increase in terms of shareable revenue is 10%, then you won't feel the loss. In this time, they do feel the loss. And this is actually what we are seeing playing out as the Senate fights over which county should get what formula should we adopt. What they're really fighting over is the quantum, the amount that's available. And the elephant in the room that's not being discussed is the 83% that is with the national government. And the question of what is the national government doing with 83% when counties are delivering water, health, agriculture, basic urban services, pre-primary education, so when the counties are holding the bulk of service delivery and they are only getting 17% of the revenue shared, collected nationally, that is a problem. And this is the question that unfortunately the Senate last year put up a good fight, but I think the conversation hasn't been consistent. And those are some of the structural and political challenges in the implementation. So this is the process. This is a big institutional change, and we've seen the phenomenal impact, despite these difficulties. We've seen the phenomenal impact of devolution, like I mentioned in Lodwar, where you have a sleepy town becoming a small, an urban center. And, this is happening across the country. Roads are being laid out, hospitals have been built, middle class have grown up. So you have a base, and actually the indicators show this, that very incremental, but there has been an improvement in terms of social economic impacts and social service delivery outcomes in agriculture, in health. It's marginal. I believe if we were sending more money down to the counties and less money was being misspent by the counties, we would have, we would now begin to approach that phenomenal change. The problem that we have, and maybe what this formula will begin to redress, is that there are counties that lost out. The big urban counties, of course, lost out with devolution, and you'll find the support for devolution will be more in counties that hadn't seen government resources. Counties that were favored, unfairly with excess resources, of course, now have to work on this objective basis of criteria, and they lost. The new formula isn't trying to redress the past. What they are trying to do is to ask, some basic questions. What are the service delivery needs? This, of course, will be determined by population. They then ask, what are the equal development needs? This is a marginalization question that favors those countries that are behind. Then they have some governance criteria that they are looking at. So it's a formula that's taking us forward in terms of saying that when we were sharing revenue before, we were using a very basic formula because we didn't really understand devolution very much. There was a lot of resistance. But now, as 10 years in, we are ready to begin getting criteria that talk about linking that money to services, which is a good thing. But of course, like I said, the problem is that the total money is not enough because 83% is being held by the national government and counties are scrapping for this 17%. We then come to, so why, despite very strong provisions in the Constitution, what are some of the gaps? If we were to go back to the question that we are asking 10 years in, what have we learned? Some of the gaps are that the Senate is not working, is not always working for the interest of the counties, because there is no direct link between the counties and the Senate in terms of representation. That senator has to go into campaigns, fight it out for himself or herself, and once elected, then there's a sense where this senator is saying, well, now I'm going to drive my own agenda. So this link is usually dealt with by senators either being elected through a delegate system from the county level, or some other link where this senator knows, if I do not speak for my county, they can recall me. They're the ones who put me here. They're the ones who can recall me. So that's a link. And when you look at BBI does not address this. How do you strengthen counties by strengthening this link? The other thing is that the Senate is weak in many regards. Actually, the one place where they have strong powers is the division and sharing of revenue. But in other regards, then they, especially like with national legislation, they are on a back foot, always being bullied by the National Assembly. So, there've been discussions about giving them veto power when it comes to county legislation so that the Senate can be able to assert itself against a government that's trying to bully them. There have also been discussions about other ways that the Senate can be made can be made stronger by giving them some oversight powers, maybe in the appointment of national ministers. And you know, the American system has that checks and balances between the Senate and the Congress. So there's a need to redress those powers. BBI does not touch this at all. BBI speaks, you know, really doesn't deal with the heart of the issues around how to strengthen devolution. Our other problem, of course, is one of political will. And this manifests, the COG, Council of Governors, did a report last year where they looked at the policies and laws that have been developed. And they found that in all sectors, national government laws are not aligned to the Constitution. 10 years on, this was last year, so 9 years on, but we know the situation is the same this year. Majority of laws are still centrist, usurp the powers of the counties. And, you know, this is in health, agriculture, you know, physical planning. You know, these are very, very important functions for proper functioning devolution. So we can say that as our devolution is struggling because the legal framework is still not aligned. And this is very, very fundamental. There's also duplication. Before the change of constitution, we had duplication. And duplication happens because government, for instance, provincial administration was duplicating, the district focus for rural development was duplicated by the CDF, was duplicated by the local authority transfer. You have all these mechanisms working at the local level, they don't work together, they get their, you know, they all have administrative costs, they all have their own budgets. There was a situation of chaos. This means at the local level, you then don't have government resources moving in the same direction. We are seeing the same. There's duplication through the parastatals that were never reformed. The the semi-autonomous government agencies that continue, some of whom implement county functions. For instance, was it the Kerio Valley that was doing the dams where they had this huge corruption? That body was supposed to have been scrapped because there was a report that first thing the president did when Jubilee came to power was order a report to reform parastatals. And the recommendations were given, you know, scrap these, align these, let's have a look at these so that we could harmonize the many semi-autonomous government agencies and parastatals that exist and that use a lot of money, that have a lot of power, that do a lot of corruption. In fact, most of national grant corruption happens through these bodies. So if you want to reform the Kenyan state, the service delivery mechanism, you have to reform this. And so the president was right. Jubilee administration was right in ensuring this report was the first call of business to release money for development, to do the Big Four agenda and things like that. But the president lacked the courage and the wherewithal to follow it through, and that report was you know, is gathering dust somewhere. And these agencies continue to enter into huge contracts and steal the money, you know. So this is what I say, we've got state failure. We've got leadership lacking at the highest level to reform the Kenyan state, because you need a lot of commitment, a lot of discernment, a lot of consistency to be able to reform the state called Kenya, which is very much captured by a bureaucracy that is stronger than, you know, the political arm. So this duplication, to my mind, is one of the biggest impediments that we have in terms of effective service delivery. And a lot of resources are eaten up in this, and it continues, including the CDF. The CDF continues. The justification for the CDF now is no longer, because the CDF came about at a time when parts of the country didn't have money. Now, every part of the country has to have money. So why isn't CDF being channeled through to the counties? Or else, if you looked at the CDF and said, well, this is a good fund, how can we align it to the Constitution? You can look at how do we ensure the CDF then supports national government functions, but in an intergovernmental way, supporting, for instance, community policing, because security is a national government function. Why doesn't CDF go and set up the county policing authorities so that you can have the intergovernmental management of security at county level and have the community policing structures from there? And the reason you don't have that is because national government police service is still extremely centralized and extremely unaccountable. And that's why we have the level of police brutality that we have. So the failure to adopt the spirit of transforming the state, because we have an administration that is steeped in the capture and the old unaccountable state. The failure to embrace the transformation agenda of the Constitution is what we are seeing manifest as the Senate fights it out right now. The last thing I'll say around equitable resource sharing is the issue of intergovernmental relations. Another place where we have seen the failure of intergovernmental relations outside of the revenue share is one aspect that was ignored during the development of the Public Finance Management Act, which is debt. In devolved systems, much as national debt is is the purview of the national government, and in Kenya, whereas counties can borrow, the guarantor is national government as a measure of control, which is fine. Much as this is a function that, or a responsibility assigned to the national government, there needs to be intergovernmental relations, because the county role in checking national government borrowing is critical, so that national government doesn't borrow at the expense of county and service delivery, which is what has happened. So there were recommendations at that time to set up an autonomous debt management. At that time, actually, they were calling for a commission or a council, an autonomous body that had county government representation and say, so that the dialogue around debt would have the checks and balances. Of course, this was ignored. And so one of the most defining problems of our day is debt. And had we set up a mechanism of checks and balances, we would not be in the situation we are in. There's a new debt policy. We are in the process of starting to review it to see if this has been dealt with. So, yes, I have been given my cue. Then, beyond equity, there's the issue of inclusion, and I'll have to rush on because I've taken too long. Inclusion is has many dimensions, and some of the dimensions are gender inclusion. This is one of the principles of the Constitution. There's also mechanisms that are there. There's also affirmative action for parts of the country, communities that are excluded, such as the equalization grant, which is financial, and others. At county level, there is a rule about 30% of the county executive must be from the other, from other ethnic groups, so you don't have majoritarianism at the county level. And then there is public participation, and there are provisions, and the Constitution is very strong about gender, very strong about inclusion, very strong about public participation, very strong about self-governance. So there's supposed to be, sovereignty is vested in the people, Article 1, but it goes beyond that to self-governance. And ironically, Nairobi, which is in disarray, Nairobi is really in disarray. Nairobi has enacted a very progressive law on neighborhood associations that are supposed to be able to take up some of the local level services and partner with the county government. This is an exercise of self-governance. It was, the law was pushed by the Kara Association for the Kenya Resident Associations, and it was enacted, of course, never implemented. So the vision of decentralized government and inclusion is based on active citizens who are not dependents, but they are partners. That is where we want to go. Unfortunately, our political leaders do not see this vision or support this vision. And with a few exceptions, like Makueni, Machakos, and others, there are a few counties that have implemented participatory governance structures. With the exception of a few, majority are still steeped in centrism. So another gap, if we are to talk about what changes would we need, is we would need to strengthen direct democracy. And I would say that to strengthen direct democracy, we would need to relook at the powers of citizens, one, to move impeachment motions against the president, against governors. We would want to look at how the constitution change process should not end with the legislature, but should end with the citizens. So the constitution gave these principles, but did not go far enough in terms of giving citizen voice the power it needs, so that there's power of petition. But when you look at the petition process, you know, there's no force given. So we'd need to look at, how do you give petitions power of recall? How do you make these very actionable? And what constitutional changes would we need? Last point is accountability. We all know there's Article 10, Chapter 6, there's Article 232 on the values and principles of the public service. But of course, these have been roundly flouted because of the political culture that we have as a nation, in our politics. The link between politics and the economy and the political elite has really undermined the foundation for this. And we say that the dilution of the accountability laws started with the NAC government. And of course, then this government has come and has taken advantage of these opportunities. But national level, county level have all violated or ignored key accountability provisions, setting up audit committees. These are very basic things. Generating quarterly implementation reports. So how would we redress this accountability? We've seen a situation where the judiciary is not able to be independent because their funding is dependent on the national executive, which is not happy with judicial rulings and so cuts the money of the judiciary, so the judiciary becomes scared. We've seen interference in judicial service appointments. So these are things that would need to be looked at. We need an independent judiciary, including independence of their budget. We need contempt of court rulings to be given force. So these are some of the things that, if we're talking of, you know, as we get into a discussion about, is our constitution serving us, is to look at where are the weaknesses and what of these weaknesses would be instrumental in terms of unlocking accountability. I think the last thing would be a need to revisit this, it's called, is it the Degwa Commission in the 70s that said public officers can trade can hold businesses outside, and what happens is they wind up then doing business and trading with government, you know, really corruption spawned from there. So there's a need to go back on that, to redress this thing where the most lucrative jobs are in government. If you really want to make money, you join government or you join politics. That is a distortion of the natural way an economy should work, because money, it needs to be made in the private sector, not in government. There are more things, recommendations, these are just, last thing, of course, would be to strengthen devolution by giving a minimum, maybe 25% minimum to counties, 5% to the equalization grant, so that there's a 30% that's guaranteed for devolution. Now, these are the changes that we would need. The BBI talks about everything else. I do support, you know, for instance, the National Assembly voting being done on party lists, because when you look at our devolution architecture, then members of parliament find it very hard to explain to citizens what they do in that national house. But of course, you want county assembly members that are elected through direct elections. But maybe the last point I would make in terms of accountability is we need to decentralize elections. We need to decentralize policing, because these have become points of impunity that are undermining the exercise of our democracy, of our constitutionalism, and they are being used by the office of the president, by the national government, to really frustrate the aspirations of the wider, of Kenyans. Thank you so much. Sorry for overrunning.
Thank you very much, Shiro. I think that was a very rich contribution and a way to spark some conversation this afternoon. I wouldn't want to summarize because there are a lot of issues that came up, and I think a lot of issues for conversation. I think some of the things that stood out for me, and not saying that not everything stood out for me, but some of the things that stood out for me, I think number one was the challenge of exclusion, which you rightly pointed out is historical in this country. And you also reminded us is structurally entrenched. And so the Constitution of Kenya comes in to try and demolish or dismantle that exclusion and create an environment of inclusion. And we're looking at inclusion in all its diversity. So looking at inclusion of women, persons with disability, areas that were marginalized geographically, economically, socially, etc. The second issue that also came out quite strongly for me was the process of democracy, which we are currently in. We've not reached the destination. And the need to strengthen direct democracy, which then means that we require active citizenship or active citizenry. And the Constitution gives us tools for that. So one is sovereignty of the people being strongly entrenched in the Constitution under Article 1. Two, the issues of public participation, but also there's a dysfunction in how that is expressed by different governments, county in their diversity, and of course, county versus national. And what are the other spaces for active citizenry to express itself, to be able to push back against a political elite that still wants to retain power and run the country like as if it's their kiosk. So remembering that citizenry are actually the bosses, they're not dependents, and they should be treated as partners. And then for me, the third issue was, of course, the tension between centralization and decentralization, and lessons that we can learn historically from things like CDF, last up, and how some of those hang-ups have been carried over into devolution. And the reminder that different governments are equal, but different and codependent, and communities are not subservient. And so there's need for dialogue to unlock some of these intergovernmental dysfunctionalities, governmental relationship dysfunctionality, remove the brinkmanship we see happening between the governments, but even between the assemblies, and strengthen the Senate to become a true defender of devolution and a champion of the people. And in all this confusion, citizens also get lost in this tension and this grandstanding. And expressing for us, I think, the value of philosophical grounding for any government before they embark on their mission and how important that is. And so when we captured it in the Constitution, the individuals given to deliver on that might not have that philosophical grounding or interest. And so we start to see clawbacks in terms of constitutionalism. And of course, the issue of accountability, which cannot be underscored enough. What becomes citizens' roles in terms of ensuring accountability? What are the frameworks that enable citizens to push for accountability? And what are the other institutions that can help us with this accountability? The challenges that the judiciary is facing with non-implementation of court orders, propaganda, frustrations around funding. Even independent commissions are not as independent as they could be. So state capture is really weakening these avenues for accountability, and we need to do something to strengthen their capacity, their independence. But even when we talk about an active citizenry, reminding the citizens that actually sit in public and state offices, that they have a responsibility to actually also implement the Constitution, to imbue the national values and principles of governance. So I don't want to talk too much. I think I want to open it up for conversation because this is actually a dialogue and a reflection. I'd like to also give you some time to look at some questions and maybe give some few people. If there's anybody that is in the Zoom call that would want to make one or two inputs, you can put up your hand. I think some of the questions that we already see coming through, we have a question around issues of diversity and inclusion. How does this play out when it comes to persons with disability? But even as we push gender mainstreaming, remembering that there are intersectionalities. So there are women with disabilities, there are persons with disability who are women, who are youth, who live in marginalized areas. So some of those things also become further complicated when we look at the challenges that you've highlighted today. Looking at the issues of other sectors and how they're experiencing this, the creative industry, when we talk about functions of government, some functions have been devolved, but of course the funding has not also followed that. Policy has not followed that. So what does this mean for the creative industry? I see Agan Odero online, so maybe he would want to comment to that. I see DTM online, so it would be good to hear from the media, their perspective. So you can see Honorable Kiwoi online, so hopefully he can also speak to some of the issues. Let's see if there are any other hands. If you're ready, Shiro, you could speak to some of those issues while I get some more questions, I think, from participants as well, and some voices from the participants.
Okay, I'll do what I can, but it is a conversation, so that it would also be interesting to hear, apart from the question, what the inputs from the participants. With regard to diversity and inclusion, with respect to people with disability, of course, I would say broadly there have been gains in terms of one, recognition, in terms of language. When I say the language, is that there's more of a mainstreaming of a recognition that you can't have a meeting, you can't have a process without people with disability appointments. So number one, the law requires, and the public service checks on this, appointments to be inclusive. There's then the other aspect, which is opportunity, economic opportunity, academic opportunity. And there have been some efforts, again, in that regard, whereby you've got the AGPO, you've got these funds that have been set up. Those have their own challenges, but those have been put there. And like Regina says, these are intersectional. You can be a woman from informal settlements, living with disability, which means that you're then looking at, you're excluded on all those levels, and it's much, much harder for you. So the law is there. There are some schemes that have been put in place. However, this philosophical barrier doesn't just affect devolution, it also affects the issue of inclusion. So that much as we've got the law, when you look at the Gender Commission, for instance, you'll find that the Gender Commission has a very small budget, and they've become so quiet in terms of how they administer their work and their programs. You expect to see a very strong advocacy role from these commissions as they push for the implementation of the 2/3 by political parties, but you don't see that. So you have commissions that would be taking up this battle, are then starved of resources, and then maybe the appointments that are made in such a way that those who land in those offices might have very good technical competencies, but there's a lot of political interest. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. When you look at the funds that have been created to support marginalized groups, they then also will be steeped in a lot of governance challenges, corruption challenges, based on the national kind of level appointments. And we did some, a review of some of these opportunities and found that they are also created in a way that's very centralized. So we need to ensure that all groups, because devolution is about power, and we are trying to wrest power away from central government elite, political and bureaucratic elites who don't want that power to come to the local level. So persons with disability, their association needs to work together with women, need to work together with groups like ours that also advocate for devolution and public participation, understanding that a win for one is a win for all. That if you don't have public participation, if you do not have effective decentralization, which are basics, then you won't have effective gender inclusion. You won't have effective representation of people with disabilities. So I think the different groups that are championing for the implementation of the Constitution need to coordinate better to deal with the challenge, the political interests that we are trying to undermine for the implementation of inclusion. So there have been gains, but we need to be a lot more strategic. Unfortunately, political elites are a few. They benefit directly. If you undermine systems, you get the economic benefit right there. Groups like ourselves, associations that represent these groups are working for the greater good, so that the benefits are not necessarily accruing to ourselves, they are accruing to others. And this makes those, our link with the beneficiaries a little bit more tenuous, and makes our work a little bit more difficult than it is for a corruption cartel that can see, for them, it's very direct. So we need to be more strategic, but we must not relent. Democracy has the ability to undermine state capture. So we need to exercise the opportunities that are available. And I think what my last point is, there's a sense of acquiescence where we say, oh, these politicians, they're so terrible. So we kind of remove ourselves from holding them to account, from speaking out when we should. Whereas in fact, the opposite is necessary. We need to keep pushing and pushing more. We need to be strategic, and we need to keep pushing, because we have the progressive gains in the Constitution, but we are fighting against the culture. So we also need our own culture to become more activist, using more aggressive forms of nonviolent protest. Creative industry. Yes, again, this is another sector that possibly gets, I don't know much, and I don't know enough about the creative industry. We don't necessarily track it, but I would say that, whereas we are saying at a public participation level, there's a lot of tokenism and lip service, I would say the same here. You need to look at the appointments that are made, and the basis of those appointments, and those who get into positions, of whether it's the film classification, whether it's the culture or other national platforms. How are those appointments made? Now, from a participatory governance point of view, you need those appointments made with the concurrence of the stakeholders. So for instance, if people are to be appointed, they should be answerable to the artists. So artists must organize, and their groups must be well organized and need to then engage politically. So devolution is the devolution of power. And once power is devolved, it needs to land somewhere. So associations must organize, must engage politically, and must demand a say. Once they do that, associations must then be accountable, because in Kenya, we then have a situation where spaces are created, and you'll find there's a national association of whoever for artists or whoever for people with disabilities. These people then, when they go to meet the minister, wanakunywa chai ama wanakula ugali. And once this has happened, whatever discussion or whatever they negotiate for, you'll see that their livelihood improves, but their association doesn't. And this is one of the things we found, that there are a lot of spaces for public participation and representation that work with government, where maybe the Law Society has a position, business associations like KEPSA sit. But the people who then sit there do not represent the constituency. So this lack of accountability is in government, but the elite are not just in government. The elite are also in our sector. So we need strategies for how to activate these. And I hope that's not too theoretical. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. I want to call on some of the participants so that we also hear different voices, not just read the questions. So I see Agan has asked a question, and maybe if you could actually just read the question out so that even the audience that is on YouTube can actually hear the voice. Agan, are you on? Are you unmuted?
I'm asking if I'm on.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my question to Wanjiru was this. I mean, listening through that very incisive presentation, which I'm very thankful about, I'm wondering that I'm listening and hearing you. On the overall, you seem to zero in on leadership and character as our biggest problem in Kenya. And I'm wondering, how do you suppose this should be tackled so that we as a people of the country, we are cushioned from this cyclic power capture or power grab by this, what I would say to be inherently wrong variants among us. We've got the institutions, we've got the constitution has really been able to give us mileage, but for the 50 years plus we've been around, we seemingly can continuously have a way or mechanism of putting wrong characters who does not have the leadership that it takes to transform a country. And this seems to be part of our national characteristic. How do we get out of this particular circle?
Thank you, Agan. I'll take two more comments and questions before I give it back to Shiro. I think Jeremiah had a question, and Abu of Uraya. Is Jeremiah there? Okay, if not, I can see. Oh, go ahead, Abu.
Yes. Yeah, for me, I don't know if it's a question, but it's just an observation. And yeah, my concern is that listening to the argument of our sort of leaders talking about how they want to share the funding of not even equalization fund, the revenue allocation, you find that really they're arguing from a very misinformed point of view. Both the ones who are supporting the new formula and even the ones who want to retain the old formula. So of course it shows a lack of understanding about why we have that that facility in the constitution and why it exists. So my concern is this: why is it that after 10 years, people who've been representing us using the new constitution are still not able to understand what they're supposed to do? I mean, is there a problem with our statecraft, how we do things? Is it that people are outside the civil society understand things better? Or, I mean, I'm just concerned that 10 years down the line, people are still arguing from very confused areas and confused point of view. So it's just a concern. What can be done? What should we do? Thank you.
Thank you, Abu. Can I take a few more, Shiro, or are you?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Please do.
Because I see a couple of hands up.
1 or 2, please.
Okay. Development through media, and then Isaiah Biwott, and then we can go back to Shiro.
Okay, Wanjiro, this is Domi. What a wonderful presentation.
Hi, Domi.
Hi. A wonderful presentation. My concern is that this, just like the gentleman who just spoke, Abu, this has been the conversation almost now for 10 years, and we are getting into of course the 10th Katiba anniversary, and I'm wondering I'm not actually wondering, I'm thinking that somehow there's a way that the leaders seems to have figured out that we, both in the civil society, as civil society organizations and civil society as citizens, are probably much ado about not so much, in the sense that, because if we are here, and you'd recall this image about a few people sitting at the end of a seesaw, and the whole population of 45 million people sitting on the other, actually holding them aloft. And I'm saying to myself, and the message is, if we only let go, they will tumble down the precipice. Of course, that's quite aggressive, but the message is very clear that we have the power. We have the numbers and we have the power, but I do think that we don't have the knowledge. So here we are, civil societies, in organizations implementing over so many years, but yet the citizen can easily be hoodwinked into believing all those stories that they are talking about county governments, when we know the opposite is indeed the truth. There's a gap somewhere. We perhaps need to figure out how to address our beneficiaries more, or equally as we address our benefactors, that kind of thing. So why is it that the citizens, this thing is good for the citizen, but they still haven't bought into it somehow? Maybe the kind of noise, and I'm using that very positively, that we are making, need to be made in a different way, in a way that brings along the citizens with us. And the reason why leaders continue doing what they did, they're belligerent about it. There's nothing we are going to do, because they do it, we cry about it, we keep quiet tomorrow, and then they go on anyway and change the law to suit them, including changing Maraga's annulment of the election, by simply going to turn the things that were annulled, the reason why the election was annulled, into law, and we don't do nothing about it. I'm being a little bit emotional about this, because I think we really need to move somewhere. Where do you think we are failing? Because we also have to sort of point at our own actions and figure out what is the best approach going forward.
Thank you, Domi. And it's important to be emotional about this country. We don't have enough people being emotional about Kenya and about the Constitution. So that is welcome. Yes.
Can I take those, and then, because
Okay.
they're quite, yeah.
Heavy.
They're quite heavy. So I think Agan and Domi are asking almost the same question, but from a different point of view, because Agan has zeroed down on the issue of political leadership and the failure, and how do we get out of the cyclical cycle, this cyclical process of bad leaders. And if you link it to what Domi is saying, these bad leaders come in, they cheat citizens. Why do they cheat citizens? And then they manipulate the elections. They make a mockery. We saw at what happened in Malawi with regard to the annulment of the presidential election. Their results turned out differently from ours. Where did we go wrong? And I'll answer with regard to Agan's question. My thinking is that this question needs to be answered on a number of levels. Number one is with regard to leadership. As civil society, or as those people growing in awareness, we need to use it or we lose it. There are safeguards that we should be using. So as Kenyans, we tolerate too much. And this is kind of, they say that Stockholm syndrome, learned dependency, where the oppressed looks to the oppressor for their salvation. This very kind of incestuous relationship where we can't stand our leaders, we know they are oppressing us, yet we go to them to, we are asking, where is the leader that will save us? So how do we get out of this? For those who are aware, let us use it or we lose it. So just start where you are. We've seen successful petitions at the local level. We've seen residents say, no, you're not grabbing that land. There's one dispute that has been going on in Embakasi with some youth group that has refused the chief to grab that piece of land. So start where you are, first of all. The other thing is, I believe this is the dialogue question. Of course, BBI purports to have had a dialogue. It wasn't a dialogue, it was some political machinations. So we do need a dialogue, and we need a dialogue that will say so, really, and the civil society should lead this, that can ask that question of how do we deal with these, how do we move from reform tinkering to revolution to transformation, because that's what the Constitution anticipates. So we made a mistake in the Constitution making process, where the Constitution was then given to the political elite that resisted it for them to implement. Of course, that didn't work. We would have needed a caretaker sort of arrangement. And even now it's evident that's, and this was the demand coming out in 2017, when the opposition was pushing for the citizen assemblies and saying, no, we want to really say this, you can't violate the Constitution. We need a system outside of this broken, captured system where we can talk. We need a level playing field. We need that level playing field, so that we can really confront a few of the underlying issues and push as citizens so that we stop this reform. You can't reform capture. I have come to that conviction. We'll use it until we use it. We build a practice of democracy that we need, but to get the reforms we need to really step out and do something revolutionary. So Domi, I would say that, same answer to you. Why haven't citizens bought in? Yeah, citizens are smart. They see that if they want to win in this game, they better play along. But then, of course, they lose, same rationale of learned helplessness. I think Wandi and Joya, and there are a few other writers who are really bringing out the role of education, of our education system, that Kenyans are very depoliticized. So we go through an education system that teaches us facts without giving us that political foundation to be able to decipher our world. That's a problem. And even us in civil society, we become very technical about processes. And really, we are very good as Kenyans. Our technical is great. Our policies are great. Our programs are great. It's the political culture that's a problem. So we need our civil society, of course, to really get outside of this technical into the political. But I don't believe civil society can reform this country without us really pushing for revolution. So we need to go back to the kind of momentum we had in the 90s, where you name the problem and say, we need this fundamental shift and we need to unlock. We need to push back against state capture, push back against violation, but then also push for a dialogue around the fundamentals. And I believe now, now is a good time because people there's a recognition that things are really not viable and citizens are ready because people are desperate. They're wondering what's gonna happen. We're facing an implosion. So it's a good time to push for revolution, the dialogue that leads to revolution. And then on the sharing of revenue, yes, with Abu, and unfortunately, my answer is kind of encompassing all of this because I don't think that the Senate doesn't understand. I do believe there's a level to which a lot of senators came in, didn't understand devolution, didn't take the time. But, 2 years in, for those who have just come in, 5 years in, 7 years in, for those who are on second terms, there's a whole Senate has committees, has technical teams that, has an administrative structure that is supposed to inform. So it's not that they don't understand. I think what the Senate is grappling with right now is that there is an issue of is two things, like I said. Number one is there's a real problem that they're losing money and they'll look terrible. How do you go to your constituents and say that you've lost money? That is untenable, that is losing votes. But they're also struggling with their own insignificance because they're thinking, if money can be given on a formula, then what is it we do? So part of it is that political resistance of say, that's why you'll find the Senate they're supposed to work well with the CRA, but sometimes will disregard what the CRA say. They work with them when it's convenient because they're politicians and they are trying to find their space. So I don't think their problem is lack of understanding. I think it's the issue of political significance. And I believe the problem that's ailing the Senate is that their vision is very small on the 17%. Their agenda should have been on the larger. Then they would have recognized that their agenda was to ensure they change the policies that are enabling the national government to take away this money. So Senate's problem is one of they lack vision and leadership. And it's really disappointing because Ken Lusaka, Speaker, former governor, should have been one to really drive an agenda. But then you have the Jubilee administration that has been very, very, on point and very effective in driving its anti-devolution agenda and in using its tyranny of numbers and its majoritarianism and, by the political party to really muzzle the Senate. So Senate understand, but they are not able to stand with the politics. And like we said, they have some weaknesses, structural weaknesses, but really it's the boldness of leadership. Leadership really is about people standing for principle and being ready to pay the price for that. And we lack that with key leaders. There are a few who have come out who are distinguishing themselves, some of them not that consistently. But, you know, so even as we lament and say so many things are going wrong, we must always recognize that there are those leaders who are standing up against the grain. There are those who are standing on principle matters. Maybe last time they didn't stand, but this time they've stood. So I go for the thinking that we must take every win and every leaf that's offered, every opportunity, and say, yes, good. This one has refused to fall into that way. Let us capitalize on that while we work on the larger. So I think we need to deal with our problem at a number of levels. We need to push for the national dialogue. As we do, we need to push back, use the courts, you know, push back against violations. And then we need to work with those political leaders who are doing the right thing. Even if they're doing it half the time, let's work with that 50%. It's better than zero. It's better than those political leaders who are off most of the time. So strategy, I think we need to be very strategic. Yeah.
Thank you, Shiro. I'll invite just 2 more comments as we start to move towards some sort of conclusion. I had Isaiah Biwott had his hand up. So if he can make his comments, and Paul Masese from Nakuru County, if you can also make some comments. If there's, let me see if there's anybody else. So let's see. And Paul Mugambi, I think just those 3 comments, and then we will take it back to Shiro and we can start to move towards some sort of conclusion. So Isaiah, go ahead.
Regina, can you encourage them to also give proposals? Because we need, obviously we need recommendations. So if they have them, it will be useful.
You had, so Isaiah and Paul, I hope you're making proposals. The 2 Pauls, I hope you're making proposals as well, not asking just questions. Isaiah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Regina and Wanjiru. My proposal is this: this country, the people who are actually on top are actually running the country like cartels, and it's time for us as citizens and the civil society to go to the grassroots and organize the communities, because the cartels are actually not providing leadership, but they are taking advantage of the positions that they have to loot from us because we are silent. So my proposal is this: as the civil society, let's go to the grassroots and do massive education and action, because I'm talking from experience, because I was in my community. I went back to, I left my town residence and went back to the community where there are no roads, everything is not working, and we organized. The communities actually lack leadership from the grassroots, because the people they elected actually went to the dining table with the looters and started hitting instead of helping the community. So my proposal is this: let's get out of our comfort zones in wherever we are and go to the grassroots, because that is where genuine people are, and they are actually willing to accept new ideas and bring about change. Otherwise, the katiba yenye tuko nayo ni sawa, hakuna shida, lakini now the problem is watu wangapi wanasoma hiyo katiba? Wachache sana. Sisi ambao tuko na hiyo information, let's scale our activities to the grassroots, because that is where action is needed. And the politicians are very clever. Wanajua watu wa mashinani hawajui chochote, and politics is about game of numbers. So they take advantage of the many ignorant people who are in the grassroots who don't ask questions to actually, if they have to loot from projects, because we had been doing some social accountability work with my colleague Paul Masese from Nakuru. And actually, when we started the programs, we realized that most people actually never knew that they had powers to ask questions about how funds are used. So our efforts to go to mashinani will actually bring about a very big change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Isaiah. And then Paul Mugambi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Regina, and for this opportunity, because it's really an informative forum. And I would like to give the following as my proposals. Number one, IBC is a government institution which is intended to create a lot of public awareness or civic engagement, which it is not currently doing. It does during the elections when you are approaching that, and you find that that one is not a good conducive environment for such a thing. Why don't we try and campaign to make IBC to become active in terms of ensuring civic engagement, public participation is well informing the public? Because one thing which I find challenging is that politicians use the lack of knowledge, lack of information for the public to make them to think that they are giving us services by themselves in terms of whether it is CDF, whether it is county government money, or whether it is national. So they create a situation whereby we become like charitable issues. When I also would like to give a proposal. One of the major things which affects maybe participation of persons' abilities in the politics or in all this, it's a question of resources. Most of us would like to participate. We have good ideas, but we lack that support in terms of ensuring that we get there. We can even perform even more than other MPs in terms of bringing out issues of legislation. Because what I find in Kenya is that we are facing a challenge of dishonesty and in terms of how we distribute the resources. If for example, I'm a member of parliament and I'm being paid by the taxpayers' money, we need to have some laws, basic laws, which tells me that when I'm an MP, I don't need to run away to get tenders from government institutions so that to allow other citizens to get an economic empowerment. Why do we have poverty increased in our country? What are the inequalities which are currently existing? It is because a few people have decided to take away a lot of massive resources by themselves, and then they distribute among a small clique. And then you find that here at the bottom, we have the largest minority, the largest population who don't have these resources. And then we find ourselves in a situation of charity mode, whereby we have to like beg for us to get something. If for example, we had those separation of power in terms of economic issues, I believe that Kenya would have at least become more equitable. When you look in terms of the land resources, or even in terms of how the way the land and the issues of information is being given out, it's not clear, because you find that people are owning a lot of land and they're not using it. There are people who are squatters, there are people who are still in the slum. These are basic things which I believe that once citizens are enabled to understand what they can really do, we have this separation of power, it can really assist. And as civil society, as much as we find ourselves they find ourselves in a situation whereby it's not active, we need to find a compromise way, a situation whereby we also educate the public on basic rights, because the basic rights of understanding that it's a government responsibility to maybe to provide water, to provide education, because sometimes you find a situation whereby this information, a politician comes and talks, and then people think that this an NGO has come to deliver them. While at the end of the day, these are our taxes. These are the real things which people need to differentiate. If you are an MP, come and help to legislate, make those separation of power, because many people don't understand that an MP's work is to legislate, not to be the one who is like always giving handouts or making people not to work well. Last proposal, it's also when we are advocating for different aspects, let's say like gender, let's say like when you are talking about persons with abilities, we should try as much as possible to look on the issue of intersectionality. For example, when we talk about gender, when this gender debate is being debated, persons with abilities are normally left out, and when women are talking among themselves, they easily forget about women with disabilities. And this one is really a big issue which needs to be really thought out and discussed. Lastly, if there is a way whereby those who are intending to make the change can form like a platform whereby these people can come out even before the election, say that, for example, let me give an example. If I'm interested in politics, we say that I'm interested to represent maybe persons' abilities in the best way possible. If I'm able to get that support, and because ideas are there, strategically you are there, but at the end of the day, you find that there are those electoral inequalities which face women and persons' abilities. Let's say like the way people use discriminatory words, the way people might start to misuse some of these privileges they have in terms of the resources. They start to say that this person is poor, he cannot do this. So such things, we need to start those platforms and also seek resources which can enable this person to participate. Because it's not an easy thing to participate in politics. Yes, you might be willing, but if you don't have that support, what really happens? So I believe I'm posing a challenge. Even if you may tell us someone to start small, we must also try to see how we can enable this person to become also empowered so that they can come out bravely and talk about the issues which they are facing. Secondly, this is also a challenge to the lawyers. They should also be ready to provide pro bono services. For example, when you talk about the court processes, currently we are talking that the parliament is wrongly constituted. The county governments do not have representatives. Out of the 47, just 17 have representations of persons with disabilities. But we are not getting maybe pro bono lawyers who can provide such services which can enable maybe persons with abilities who are not represented, or maybe women who would like the parliament to be dissolved, to be supported. So I believe that also us as professionals, sometimes we need really to come out and contribute to this debate. We know that there is that economic challenge, but at the end of the day, there are those services. Let's try and also look for such opportunities so that they can enable more persons to be able to be engaged. And at least I can say for myself as a blind person who is a public policy scholar, through this COVID, I've learned a lot from different platforms, which before I wouldn't have participated, because sometimes information is not there. We are not involved. Sometimes the information is not even accessible. Even I can just confirm to you, it took me after 2 months is when I learned how to put a mask on my face, because people who are giving all this information never conducted it in a more accessible manner. So it was a question of when someone saw me wearing it in a wrong way, told me this mask is worn in this way. So at the end of the day, you find that those lack of accessible information or alternative mode of communication is also making us to be left out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Wanjiro to make, I think, concluding comments and her parting shot. And then we can start proceeding to wrapping up this conversation, which this is only just the beginning. We can never actually conclude on such a conversation.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Isaiah and Mugambi. And I'll focus, I won't try and answer the question because we are all trying to figure this out, but I'll take the recommendations and I will say that what should Nane, the institutions, Inuka and the institutions that are behind the Nane movement be thinking about, because that's why we are here. We are not here just to discuss and get upset and then go and say, oh, we had a good discussion. We are here to inform something. So now we can say, we want to talk back to the Nane and tell them, this is what we expect to see. First of all, there's a point I forgot with Abu's question on sharing of revenue. Because I didn't, I gave my view on what is happening there. But Abu, there is an opportunity for dissolution. If Senate is unable to agree, then maybe legally we might have grounds for dissolution. Recently, the court ruled that with the division of revenue, if the mediation process fails, there is ground for dissolution. So it might be worth testing if this also falls in that category, because the threat of dissolution is one that wakes Parliament up very much. So, as part of our process of enforcing accountability, we'd like to tell Nane, first recommendation, let us pursue the option of dissolving Parliament because Senate has failed to pass this, to agree on the sharing of revenue. Then another recommendation given was that there is need for a platform, because I think what's coming out here is that there are initiatives happening in some way or other, but they are not unified. So there is need for this platform for revolution. And I'm keeping away from the word reform because, like I said, this idea of incremental reform, it's not working. When you have the level of state capture we have, it doesn't work. We need a revolution. We want one that is peaceful, but it needs to be a revolution. For that, we need a platform that has a good strategy. So Nane, we don't want to have another conversation. Next time, we want to see that the conversation is part of a strategy that is taking us somewhere. Grassroots, yes, there is the impunity. Of course, corruption has been devolved alongside, the power and everything. The thinking had been that if we can hold county level leadership to account, we will build a culture of democracy and, begin to transform the way governance is done. We have found that that hasn't really worked. In some places, of course, we can say there is more accountability than there was before. So we could say that at least we are somewhere, but we haven't seen, for instance, recall being done on county assembly members. We haven't seen, this kind of very active push for accountability of our political leaders by citizens. So again, Nane, we need to make this a big agenda item. Our political leaders should not be getting a free ride of 5 years once they're elected. They need to be elected and then they are kept on their toes, and that is by active citizens. So as part of the Nane movement, we need to look and say, is it apathy? Is it because citizens perceive the process of removing a political leader as almost impossible? The court had to rule that, yes, somebody, you can recall the law that was passed by Parliament was unconstitutional because it prevented that. So how do we strengthen citizen redress? How do we activate citizens to hold leaders to account and then make sure they hold leaders to account? And of course, the issue of elections, that's a big issue after what happened in 2017, the present state of the IBC. This is an issue that needs to be put squarely on the agenda, the Nane agenda, saying there is no way we can go into elections in this kind of situation and work with institutions like ILOG, of which Regina is part, or you introduced yourself and another title maybe was part. So how do we deal with that? Issue of land comes up because obviously land reforms in this country stalled for obvious reasons, because especially under this particular administration, if the land agenda was to be executed, the land reform agenda was to be executed, it would impinge very much on the first family. So that agenda had to be stalled. There's also the truth and reconciliation process that stalled. These need to be reawoken. And I'll tell you something, beyond the issue of historical injustice, unlocking land, is so critical for the survival of devolution, because the main primary source of revenue for counties is property rates. This is what can transform urban centers and help them get their autonomy. So the land reform agenda, I think, can be recrafted into a development agenda so that stakeholders can join it by saying, unless we address this land issue, access to land, the valuation roles of land linking to that, so that counties can earn revenue, transparency in this process, the land boards, blah, blah, all of that. Unless we address that as a country, we will not grow, because it means one of our primary resources is undermined. So Nane needs to pick up this agenda. We need to get outside the box, reawaken this conversation. Yes, then litigation. Mugambi talked about the issue of litigation being very costly. And I was having a conversation with a friend recently, and actually we were reflecting that the LSK now has very dynamic leadership that has come out very strongly on constitutionalism. They need to also look internally and look at the structuring of legal fees in this country is unsustainable. And access to justice has been costed out for most Kenyans. And this needs reform being driven possibly from the Attorney General's office, but by the legal profession itself, LSK itself. And, again, maybe the need to break up the LSK, which is also very centralized, and take models of other countries where you have different bars. So you have more competition, but also paying attention to access to justice. Lastly, I'll just say that COVID offers an opportunity and risks. A risk is what we can see happening in Nairobi, and where the COVID outbreak is used as a pretext of national government to encroach on, to undermine personal freedoms, use force to enforce various measures, and under the lockdown or various restrictions, then go on to do commit other violations against the people. Those are the risks. The opportunities are, one, people have seen that this thing called democracy and accountability is not a joke, that we can be wiped out in one fell swoop if we don't pay attention to where the money goes. There's also a recognition that we must spend on basic services. Healthcare must be deepened up to the dispensary in your ward. And this is, food security and food systems. So basic services have come back on the agenda. So we need to push back against this idea that, 1 trillion or 1.5 trillion is tied up in large infrastructure projects, while we don't spend on everyday basic services. So we need to push back against this trend, not just of corruption, but of financing development that is promoting elitism, and also undermining basic services. So we have a lot to do. Nane needs to drive us with a clear strategy. If you look at the strategies of Black Lives Matter, of the civil liberation campaign in the States, liberation movements in Africa, they were strategic. They were not just angry, making demands, but strategic. I think we need to be more strategic in this country, given the type of change that we are trying to get is one that's operating in a very complex environment where we have some gains, we have some good guys, we have lots of bad guys, we have a good constitution. So our strategy needs to be able to deal in this complex environment, but to make sure that we bring citizens along with simplified, sufficiently simplified communication. So Nane, I think, needs to be, a platform for revolution. And hopefully this conversation is a contribution towards that. Thank you, Regina.
Thank you very much, Shiro. Couldn't have said it better. I think as we come to the end, just a few concluding remarks from myself. I wouldn't dare try, I think, summarize what Shiro said. But what comes out very clearly is that the champions of the Constitution of Kenya need to coordinate better. They need to be strategic, they need to be multi-sectoral, and to even map up to the sector working groups that government has at national or county level. We need to coordinate across issues, across sectors, across professionals, to ensure that citizens are all carried along. We need to organize, we need to be consistent, because it's not a one-off affair. So it's not that Nane comes and goes, and up until next year, nobody's having this conversation. We're still lamenting about the same issues. The Constitution, of course, reminds us that we should actually be exercising our inalienable right, to our sovereign and inalienable right to determine the form of our governance of our country. And having fully participated in the making of this Constitution, we then have a responsibility to defend it, to promote it, and to ensure that it is implemented in the spirit that it was written, and to give us the aspirations that we have captured therein. Increasingly, she has also reminded us that dialogue around the fundamentals is key, especially for unlocking some of the dysfunction we see in government structures, a dysfunction that is manufactured for elite political interests. And this dialogue is required so that we can have some harmony in how governments are organized, in how policies are harmonized across the different governments, across county and national governments, in how the laws are passed, in how departments are structured, and in how citizens are engaged. If leadership seems to be a consistent failing point, because they lack grounding in philosophy and they lack an interest in the sovereignty of the people of Kenya and delivering for the people of Kenya, then we should be, we've been challenged, I think, by several speakers, not just by Shiro, to test this Constitution to its limits. We should be able to recall, test the recall clause, in as much as they try to make it very difficult to do. We should be pushing for dissolution. If the Senate and the National Assembly are not delivering, dissolve, let them go home. We should be ready to protest and demonstrate. So flood the streets, boycott services, boycott elections if it's required, exercise citizens' arrest. If our challenge is that court orders are ignored, we're not able to get warrants of arrest, let's do citizens' arrest. Let's be bold and take the road less traveled. If we have to, let's blacklist, especially the leaders we feel are consistently failing us. Blacklist them and let them know that they are blacklisted, and this is why they are blacklisted. But most of all, we also must be consistent and continue pushing our unfinished business. Land being one of those unfinished businesses that we get tired of pushing. Leadership being an unfinished business that we also drop along the way. Quality of leadership. We deserve quality leadership. And so those are some of the things we have to be consistent in pushing. The Constitution of Kenya is the revolution, but the revolution, is yet to be televised. because it actually needs courage. And the courage required is courage of numbers, courage of individuals in all their spaces to push some of these conversations. So I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon, for the brilliant questions and the comments. Today is just the beginning of the conversation. Let's keep it going on the various platforms. They can comment on YouTube, there's Facebook, there's Twitter. And this, as I mentioned earlier, is just one of a series of webinars. It's the fourth. So we have another conversation tomorrow. And tomorrow's conversation focuses on the politics of amendments to the Constitution. As a brilliant speaker at Sango Chesoni, a former member of the Committee of Experts on the Constitution, and will be moderated by the wonderful Daisy Amdani. So hopefully you'll also tune in at the same time tomorrow and continue this conversation into that space as well. I want to thank you, Shiro, very much for availing your time and for giving us reflections and food for thought, for challenging us, and for also reminding us, taking us back to our history, importantly, because Nane is a historical event. And one of the things the Constitution also asks us to do is to remember by honoring those that heroically struggled to bring freedom and justice to our land. And they don't get mentioned on Shujaa Day, they don't get mentioned in the history books, but they pushed and got us to where we are now. So we have a responsibility to move to the next level. And so thank you, Shiro, a true active Kenyan citizen. I had people saying that civil society should, civil society should, civil society should. But my feeling is always that Kenyans should, everybody should, I should, you should, we should continue to challenge, to push, to play our role, to hold our leaders accountable, to make sure our systems work. So make sure you tune in tomorrow, I think, for tomorrow's webinar. As we conclude, I want to say thank you again to everybody. Thank you to Shiro. Thank you to Inuka for coordinating all of us around these conversations. And just to remember that history is important. So as we move towards Nane, there are things that we can do. We don't have to wait for the webinars. I know various people are doing various things, but there are things each and every one of us can do, even if it is just to read up on what Nane means, starting from Saba Saba, Nane. And then next month, we also have an event. It's 10 years of the Constitution, so having our own personal reflections, questions, etc. We all have a role to play in honoring those that went before us, that sweated, that bled, and even died for this Constitution. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shiro, and good afternoon.